On the barren highlands of West Mesa, where the wind scratches against rock like the cries of forgotten souls, a frail old man stumbled upon a near-dead foal beneath a pale yucca grove. He didn't know its name, only saw a star-shaped mark on its forehead. Placing his hand on its chest, he whispered, "You're alive. Then let's start over." No one could have guessed that abandoned creature would one day rewrite an American legend. The wind howled across the West Mesa Plateau, a land where the sun never seemed to sleep. The red earth here was as hard as kiln-fired brick, cracked beneath human footsteps, and so barren that even the weeds had to fight to survive. It was not a place for the weak. Which is why no one was surprised when Clayton Hargrove, the owner of the oldest purebred horse ranch in the region, decided to give up on a creature too fragile to endure such a place. Clayton walked silently down the row of horse stalls, tall and broad-shouldered, with ash-gray eyes and a voice that never rose above a dry murmur. He moved as though nothing on earth could shake him. His boots thudded steadily on the dry wooden floor, blending with the wind, whistling through the slats and the scattered cries of horses from afar. Then he stopped, in front of the final stall at the end of the row. Inside stood a small, frail foal. Its coat was a dusty light brown, almost the same hue as old sandstone, and it trembled in the shadows. But in the slanted light spilling through the window, one thing stood out, a strange white mark on its forehead, shaped like a small star. Clayton furrowed his brow. He stood still for a moment, then shook his head coldly, without an ounce of compassion. "Useless," he muttered, just loud enough for Noah, the young stable hand sweeping nearby, to hear clearly. Noah paused, set down his broom and stepped closer. "Mr. Clayton," he said softly, trying not to sound confrontational. "I've seen him eating more these past few days, honestly." Clayton turned to him, his gray eyes calm and stone-like. 3 weeks, Noah. He still trips over his own legs. What do you think I'm feeding him for?" I think he has a shot. His mother was Wild Mirage, right? She used to." Clayton raised a hand to cut him off. "She won 3 endurance titles. But this one doesn't have fire in his blood." He turned, his voice as cold as nightfall. "Take him behind the canyon. Tie him up. Let nature handle the rest." Noah stood frozen. He'd only worked here for less than a year, but it was enough to know Clayton never repeated himself. Still, something inside his chest clenched tight. He looked at the foal, who now stared back at him with weary eyes, as if it already knew what was coming. That night, the moon rose slowly. Its pale light slid across the gray rocks and lit the narrow path behind the ranch, a path no one used unless they were trying to hide something. Noah led the foal along, each step heavier than the last, burdened with his own silent anger. He didn't tie it, but he didn't dare lead it elsewhere either. Instead, he let go of the rope and stood there for a while. The foal didn't move. Its legs were still too weak, its back was all bones, and its breathing was uneven, shallow. "I'm sorry, little one," Noah whispered. "You don't deserve this, but I don't know what else to do." He looked around. Just sagebrush, yucca, and the wind. No people, no hope. Noah bent down, picked up a small stone, and tossed it behind the foal to scare it off. The stone didn't hit, it just made the foal flinch and step back a bit. It looked at him again, eyes heavy with sorrow. "Go," Noah murmured. "Go far away from here. Maybe you'll find someone. Or maybe peace will come easier than this place." He turned away, not daring to look back. But what he didn't know was that in that moment, a moment when someone without power still chose to act with kindness, his life would change forever. The next morning, Clayton didn't say a word. He just tossed Noah a new task list and walked away like the foal had never existed. Noah worked in silence, but his mind wasn't at peace. He kept thinking about the foal. Was it still alive? Had it found water? Had a predator found it first? That night he slipped back out to the canyon, but the foal was gone. Only a trail of small hoof prints stretched westward into the uninhabited wild. Noah stood for a long time, then quietly returned. What he didn't know was that, far across the mesas, where the red earth kissed the sky and wind whispered of forgotten things, an old man was quietly chopping firewood, and fate was already weaving its threads to lead him toward the last star still shining in the dark. At the far western edge of West Mesa, about 10 dusty miles from the Hargrove Ranch, there was a stretch of land nearly wiped off the map. No power lines, no phone signal, no road signs, No visitors, except for one man. Earl Whitaker, 68 years old, living alone on that parched land. A faded pinewood cabin was what he called home, next to a warped tin-roofed shed and a rough wooden fence built by the same hands that once trained legendary racehorses at Churchill Downs. Once upon a time, Earl's name made Kentucky gamblers hold their breath. Back then, when he stepped onto the track in his old straw hat and dirt-caked boots, people knew something was about to happen. But that era, the age of the horse whisperer king, was long gone. People forgot, and Earl chose to vanish from the spotlight. He wasn't angry, he wasn't bitter, he just chose silence. His only companion now was Clementine, a speckled gray mule, gentle and loyal, who had followed him across hundreds of western miles, through snow-covered winters and blistering summers alike. That morning, Earl woke earlier than usual, stirred by a strange feeling, a kind of instinct only old men have, those who've lived too long with the rhythms of nature. He heard something, faint, between the rustle of wind weaving through the yucca, a wheezing breath, ragged and short. He set his axe down beside the half-split log and followed the sound, stepping past sagebrush choked in red dust. Beneath the shade of a sun-split boulder, he found it, a foal, skin and bones, lying on its side, barely able to twitch. Its eyes were closed, its nostrils coated in grit. Earl thought for a second he might be hallucinating. He dropped to his knees, placing a rough, calloused hand gently on its neck. A pulse. Faint, but there. "Oh, Lord above," he breathed. "What brought you all the way out here, kid?" The foal trembled slightly. Earl pulled off the scarf from around his neck, soaked it with water from his flask, and began wiping the layers of dirt from its face. Slowly, the grime faded, revealing a mark, a pale, faint star, right in the center of its forehead. He paused. His old heart suddenly beat faster. There was something about this, something beyond logic. "Starling," he said aloud, as if the name had floated into his head from somewhere beyond. "You're a fallen star." It took nearly an hour to lift Starling onto Clementine's back. The old mule seemed to understand. She stepped carefully over loose stone, slow and steady. The sun was climbing now, blazing hot, but Earl didn't care. Back at the ranch, he cleaned out the old stall, spread fresh straw, laid Starling down, then rushed to fetch water. He ground oats by hand using a stone mill, mixed it with the last of the honey left in his cupboard. The entire day he sat by Starling's side. Every few minutes he dripped water onto its lips. When it coughed for the first time, he almost cried. The last time he cared for a creature this small was 10 years ago, the last time he touched a racehorse. "I don't know where you came from, little one," he said as he gently cleaned the scratches along Starling's legs. "But I know one thing. Someone threw you away, just like they once threw me here." Night fell fast. The wind from Black Ridge rolled in, icy and sharp. But in the old wooden stall, amid dry straw and the flicker of lantern light, Earl lay curled on his side, one hand resting on Starling's warm flank. The breath of two lonely souls rose and fell together, gently warming the cruel desert air. By dawn, Starling opened its eyes. For the first time in days, it scanned the room, alert, aware. Earl saw it, and he smiled. In the weeks that followed, life at the little ranch changed. Each morning, Earl would boil warm water, mix it with oats, a pinch of sea salt, and a touch of linseed oil, as advised by the old vet up north. Starling, no longer the trembling wreck, now stood at the stall gate, tapping a hoof like it was demanding breakfast. Earl would chuckle. "Easy there, kid. I've only got 2 hands and 1 heart, and you're hogging more of it every day." When Starling first tried to stand, it shook and collapsed. Earl didn't scold. He just sat beside it and said with a smile, "Let's try again. We're not quitting." Clementine often stood nearby, quiet like an older sister watching over the youngest. And then came the day Starling finally stood tall on all 4 legs. Earl sat back overcome, as if hearing a song he thought the world had forgotten. "Looking good, kid," he said with a grin. "I'll train you. Not to race, not to sell, just so you'll know you're worth something." As summer slowly faded into fall, Earl began taking Starling out to the back paddock. It was still weak, but now it walked circles around the old pine tree, sniffed the dry grass, and nudged its head into Earl's chest every time he approached. "We're both throwaways, you and me," Earl said one afternoon, sitting in his weathered chair with a tin cup of coffee. "But sometimes, what the world tosses aside ends up being what it needs most." No one knew Earl had saved Starling. No one witnessed the quiet miracle unfolding on forgotten land. But that didn't matter to Earl, because to him, watching a horse choose to live again was enough proof that he himself was still alive. Autumn in West Mesa wasn't like anywhere else. The wind carried the scent of sun-scorched grass, red earth torn open by hooves, and a chill that seeped into the bones even while the sun still burned bright above. Yet in the middle of this parched landscape, in a small wooden stall on a rocky hillside, something was growing, quietly, stubbornly. Starling, the foal once discarded like biological waste, could now stand, walk, and even smile in his own way. Each morning, when Earl stepped out of his cabin carrying a water jug and a pail of oats, Starling would lift his ears and let out a soft whinny, not strong, not loud, but just enough to make Earl pause and smile deep from within. "Morning, kid," he'd say. "I added honey today. Better than the store-bought stuff, I promise." Of course, no one ever answered him. But every time Starling looked back at him, his eyes shimmered like a lake catching the breeze. One crisp morning, Earl led Starling out to the little yard behind the house. The first seasonal chills softened the sun's sting and cooled the dust. Starling had grown stronger. The once shaky legs now stood firm. The dull brown coat had turned sleek, glinting golden wherever sunlight touched it. "Let's start training," Earl murmured, tying a rope to a simple collar he had hand-woven from old lasso strands. No whips, no shouting, just Earl's calm, patient voice. Every step Starling took was guided by gestures so gentle they could have been lullabies. Day after day, around the paddock Earl had built the year before, Starling learned to walk evenly, to stop on cue, and, most importantly, to trust. A month passed. Starling had changed. He was stronger, sharper, more alert than any horse Earl had ever trained. But more than that, he was different. Starling didn't just listen with his ears, he listened with his eyes. He didn't just react, he considered. And after every session, he would walk over and rest his head on Earl's shoulder, as if saying thank you. One late afternoon, as Earl was trimming Starling's hooves, the distant hum of an engine made him look up. A dark red pickup truck crept slowly along the rocky road. Earl narrowed his eyes. Almost no one drove this far out unless they were land scouts or trouble. The truck stopped at the front gate. The door opened. A young woman stepped out, black hair tied back, wearing a plaid shirt, faded jeans, and dusty cowboy boots. She shaded her eyes, scanned the field, and froze when she saw Earl. "Uncle Earl?" she called hesitantly. "Do you remember me?" Earl squinted and walked closer. Then recognition dawned. Lana Whitaker?" "It's me." Lana, his only niece, daughter of his late younger brother, had left New Mexico at 19 for college in Austin and never returned. They'd only kept in touch through scattered letters and the occasional Thanksgiving call. "I thought you'd gone to live with Mom," Lana said with a half smile, stepping into the yard. "I don't do well with tile floors, air conditioning, or concrete walls." Earl shrugged. "Out here I've got sky, fresh air, and Clementine. And now? Starling." "Starling?" Lana turned toward the stall, her gaze locked with the horses. Time seemed to stop. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Do you even know what that horse is?" Earl raised an eyebrow. "I know he's a friend." "No, I mean the breed. He's a pure Mustang, High Plains genotype. Incredibly rare. Look at the forehead star and the prominent brow bone. That's fighting stock." Earl didn't answer. He looked at Starling as if seeing him for the first time through a new lens. "I work in social media for a wild horse protection group," Lana continued. "I've seen dozens of Mustangs, both wild and tamed. But this one, he's different." Earl sat on the porch step, his gaze never leaving Starling. "He's not like any I've ever known. He knows when I'm sad. He smells the rain before it comes. He likes guitar music. And every time Clementine coughs, he stands closer." Lana chuckled, then paused. "Uncle, you're not planning to keep him hidden here forever, are you?" "What are you getting at?" "This horse needs to be seen. The world needs to see him." Earl shook his head. "The world already threw him away once. I'm not sure it deserves a second chance." "Maybe not. But some people need him, to believe that life still has a shot." That evening, Earl sat strumming his old guitar on the porch. Lana sat beside him, eyes drifting to Starling sleeping in his stall. The wind rustled through the yucca fields, carrying the scent of damp earth and late-blooming wildflowers. "I think he's a symbol, Uncle," Lana said softly. Earl nodded, still playing. "To me, He's rebirth. A few days later, Lana asked to film Starling. She kept it simple, just a smartphone on a tripod, bathed in the golden light of a late afternoon. Starling ran around the paddock. Every hoofbeat echoed like a drum. Dust kicked into the air. Sunlight caught the sweat on his coat. And his eyes, they gleamed with a light that had never known despair. Lana uploaded the video with the title, Starling, the Forgotten Mustang. Within 3 days, it had over 100,000 views. Within a week, 1 million. Messages and comments poured in. Where did he come from? Who saved him? How can we help? Then came the phone call. Hello, this is Russell Price, director of the Desert Grace Derby in Colorado, came a warm, measured voice on the line. I just watched the video of Starling. His story, it's deeply moving. Earl was speechless. We'd like to invite you and Starling to participate in this year's event. No entry fee. We'll cover all travel and lodging. We just believe people need to witness something truly beautiful. Earl glanced toward the stall. Starling was chewing straw, eyes half closed. Are you still there? Price asked. I'm asking my friend, Earl replied. If he says yes, we'll come. He hung up and walked outside. Starling raised his head to meet him. Earl let out a soft whistle, a sound laced with memory. Starling stepped forward and nudged his muzzle into Earl's palm. Earl whispered, You ready to show them who you are, kid? And Starling, in his own quiet way, gave his answer. Winter in West Mesa didn't bring pristine snow like the Colorado mountains. Here the cold crept in slowly, but once it arrived, it burrowed into the bones, slipping through cracks in wooden doors and beneath layers of worn-out coats. The wind screamed off the sandstone cliffs, carrying fine dust and the scent of sun-dried sagebrush. And yet, it was in this brutal season that Starling seemed to grow, like he'd been born of the wind itself. Every morning, Earl woke before dawn. He carefully cooked oat porridge, sprinkled in mineral salt and linseed oil, just like the vet recommended. Starling, no longer the frail, trembling foal, now stood by the stall gate, stomping the ground impatiently, as if to say, Come on, old man. Earl would chuckle. Hold your horses, kid. I've only got 2 hands and 1 old heart, and you've about taken up the whole thing. But the moment that changed Earl's life came one cool afternoon in early spring. The sky was mild, the sunlight as soft as a woolen blanket. Earl was cleaning out old straw from the stall when he heard a sharp whoosh, a slicing sound through the air. He looked up just in time to see a wild antelope darting across the field, kicking up dust as it flew past the paddock. Its hooves struck the ground like gunshots echoing through the canyon. And then, Starling bolted. No rider, no reins, no hesitation. He shot forward like an arrow, chasing the antelope as it disappeared over the hill. Earl stood frozen. He had never seen a creature move like that, not even the champions he'd trained in Kentucky. Starling wasn't running, he was flying. Each hoofbeat was a thunderclap, each bound a fusion of wind, earth, and golden dusk. And in that moment, Earl didn't see a castaway or a broken thing. He saw something pure, something greater than words. That night, when Lana came by to visit, Earl told her everything. His eyes lit up like they hadn't in years. I don't need a camera to remember it, he said, voice trembling. I carved it into my heart. When Starling runs, the wind changes direction. Lana, usually composed, bit her lip to hold back tears. Uncle, I want to repost the clip of Starling running, but this time I'll include your story too. Earl was quiet. He was never one for putting himself on display, but he understood. Some stories needed to be told, not for glory, but to remind people that miracles still happen in forgotten places. All right, he said, but don't call me a hero. If anyone's the hero, it's him. The new clip went live just past midnight. It included footage of Earl brushing Starling's mane with his wrinkled hands, resting his palm on the horse's chest, listening to its heartbeat. And Earl's voice saying, We're both forgotten, but that doesn't mean we can't run like the wind. By morning, it had over 3 million views. News outlets took notice. Wild horse organizations across the country reshared it with a single line, the Mustang that flew over West Mesa. Then came another surprise. A handwritten letter, rare in the age of email, arrived in the old wooden mailbox outside Earl's cabin. To Mr. Earl Whitaker, from Russell Price, Director, Desert Grace Derby. If Starling can run, the world needs to see it. We invite you and Starling to Colorado for this year's race. No fees, all expenses covered. Not for trophies, but for spirit. We need stories like yours to remind us that belief can save a life or a generation. Earl read the letter again and again. One line made his hands tremble. And if you accept, we will register Starling, not as horse of unknown origin, but as Starling, horse of Earl Whitaker, West Mesa. What do you think? Earl asked Lana that evening, the two of them sitting beside a small fire pit. Lana looked at him, then over at Starling, resting his chin on the stall rail. I think he was born to show the world what hope looks like, and that shape is him. Earl smiled and nodded, but then hesitated. Do you think he remembers the person who left him behind? Maybe, Lana replied gently. But I think what matters more is who's still here. The day they left, it rained lightly, the first gentle rain in weeks. Clementine stayed behind, watched over by the neighbors. Lana drove. Starling rode in a borrowed trailer from a friend in the horse rescue network. On the road to Colorado, Earl kept glancing at the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of Starling's tail through the cracks. You think he'll be okay? He asked. Lana smiled. He won't just be okay. He's on his way to becoming a symbol. When they arrived, the entire Desert Grace Derby team was there to greet them. Cameramen, reporters, even children from the local school gathered by the track. But what moved Earl most was the sign hanging outside the stable. Starling, the horse of West Mesa. That night in Colorado, Starling stood beneath the stars. Earl stepped beside him, resting a hand on his neck. Tomorrow, they'll see you. But remember, kid, you've got nothing to prove. You already won on the day you didn't die. Starling let out a low, steady whinny, not loud, but clear. Then he pressed his head against Earl's chest. The night was cold. But Earl wasn't. Because in that moment, he knew. Life had brought him back to something he thought he'd lost forever. Faith. On the morning of the Desert Grace Derby qualifying round, a thin mist still clung to the Colorado plains, casting a silver veil over the racetrack and the distant bleachers. The mountain range on the horizon glowed a deep indigo, and gusts of sharp wind brushed past foreheads like a quiet warning. This land was not meant for the weak. Starling stood in his temporary stall, eyes calm, unwavering. He didn't fidget, didn't snort, not like the other horses bucking and stomping. Earl stood beside him, one hand gently stroking the ridge of his nose, the other clutching a slowly cooling cup of coffee. Today's not about winning, kid, he whispered. Just run like yourself. Lana adjusted his scarf from behind. They've been whispering about Starling all morning, saying he's a no-name horse from a nowhere place, led by an old man the world forgot. Earl smiled, lopsided. Then it's the perfect story. Let's give them something they'll remember. The moment Starling stepped out onto the track, the western bleachers fell silent. It wasn't because he was large. He was smaller than most of the other racers. It wasn't because he was glamorous. His bronze coat, though sleek, lacked the polish of the show-prepped stallions. But there was something in his gaze, deep, direct, that made people forget to blink. That horse looked straight into my soul, whispered a young woman in the crowd. Earl led him to the starting position. He gave a final stroke down his neck. Fly, kid, show them who you are. The horn sounded. Starling didn't bolt ahead. In fact, at first, he lagged behind. The other horses launched like missiles, kicking up clouds of dirt and drawing roars from the crowd. But by the second lap, Starling began to move. He didn't gallop with panic. He flowed, stride after stride, steady, grounded, relentless. Each hoofbeat gripped the earth and lifted again like rhythm, not noise. He wasn't forged in a training arena. He was honed by dust, wind, and survival. People stood up, one by one. The noise built like thunder. On the final stretch, Starling overtook the lead horse with a quiet burst of speed, like a gust of wind that no one saw coming. No whip, no spurs, just heart. He crossed the finish line, head high, ears up, chest heaving. The stadium erupted. Lana burst into tears. Earl stood frozen, his eyes too dry to cry, too full to speak. Russell Price, the Derby director, stepped onto the track and shook Earl's hand. Congratulations. You didn't just bring a horse, you brought the soul of the high plains. But while the crowd celebrated, another face stood out in the stands, stern, sharp, unmoved. Clayton Hargrove. He didn't cheer, didn't stand, just stared at Starling with an icy fury. Beside him was a man in a dark suit, holding a manila folder. That evening, as Earl brushed Starling's legs, a knock came at the stall door. A local sheriff stood beside the man in the black suit. They handed over a document. The horse known as Starling, identifiable by the white star on his forehead, is property of Hargrove Ranch, under birth registration number 48B. Earl froze. He looked at Lana. She scanned the document, her face tightening. "Uncle, did you ever think he might have official papers?" Earl shook his head. "To me, he wasn't a possession." Starling was taken the next morning. The online world exploded. The hashtag Bring Starling Home flooded every platform. A video of him being led onto a trailer, eyes wide and confused, went viral within hours. Lana launched a live stream, eyes red, voice shaking. "We don't have power, but we have this story. And if you're hearing it, help us do what's right." At Hargrove Ranch, Starling was locked in a private stall. Cameras, security. Clayton wasted no time. He planned to push Starling into fast-track training for a major summer championship. But Starling wouldn't eat, wouldn't run, wouldn't react. "Whip him into it," Clayton roared. The trainer obeyed. The leather struck Starling's hide. He didn't flinch, didn't buck. He just stood there, eyes locked on the fence, staring out as if the world he knew lived somewhere beyond it, where an old man once laid a hand on his chest, where silence meant safety. The next day, Clayton made a call. "Noah, you're the only one he ever trusted. I'm hiring you back. Do whatever it takes to make him run again." Noah returned. He stepped into the stall, slowly extended his hand. Starling looked, but didn't move. "Remember me?" Noah whispered. "I'm the coward who left you the first time." He sat down beside the hay pile, picked up a few strands and held them to Starling's mouth. The horse didn't bite. "Who are you waiting for?" Noah asked. But in his heart, he already knew. That night, Noah drove out to Earl's. "Mr. Whitaker, I think, if you come, he'll come back to life." Earl looked up at the ceiling, where his old saddle hung untouched for 10 years. "I'm no trainer anymore, Noah." "No, but you're his family." A week later, the National Derby opened in Colorado. Starling was walked into the arena, his eyes dull, steps lifeless like something stolen from the wind. The crowd murmured. No one could believe the same horse that dazzled Desert Grace was now a ghost. The officials looked concerned. Clayton's trainer shouted commands, but Starling didn't move. Until, from the far edge of the arena, came a whistle. Soft, but clear as church bells in the desert. Starling jolted, his ears perked, his head turned, his eyes caught something, and lit up like fire. He saw Earl, wearing his old flannel, one hand over his chest, eyes shining. The stadium went silent. Starling moved, then galloped. Not down the track, but off course, breaking through the dirt lane, heading straight for the fence where Earl stood. People screamed, children gasped, adults wept. A voice shouted from the crowd, "The horse is choosing his home." Starling skidded to a halt before Earl and buried his face into his chest like a child finding his parent after being lost. Clayton ran forward, yelling, "Stop him! Take him back!" But the crowd rose like a wave. "Let him stay! Let him stay!" The chant thundered across the arena. That night, the video of Starling breaking free to return to Earl aired nationwide. Lana launched a petition. Within 48 hours, over 2 million signatures. 1 week later, the governor signed an executive order transferring custody of Starling to Earl Whitaker on grounds of humane care, animal loyalty, and emotional welfare. Starling was returned to West Mesa. And one spring afternoon, among the blooming white wildflowers, Starling galloped full stride, not for trophies, not for glory, but for freedom. Earl stood on the porch, leaning on his old cane, smiling at Lana. Sometimes, all it takes is one creature believing in you to change the whole world. 1 month after Starling returned to West Mesa, the little ranch felt alive again. People from across the state began showing up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Mustang that chose his home. Not because he'd won a race, but because he had taught the entire country that even abandoned beings can carry a spirit that refuses to break. The media called it the Starling phenomenon. Publications like the Denver Sun, Horse and Liberty, and even National Chronicle ran full-length features. Photos of Starling standing beside Earl Whitaker, the forgotten old trainer, became a national symbol of loyalty and rebirth. Earl sat on the porch, sipping black tea, watching Starling run through the field of snowflowers. His back was still hunched, his hands still rough, but something in his eyes had straightened. A fire long gone had returned. Lana stepped out of the house, holding her old leather-bound notebook, the one she used to sketch out her future plans. "Uncle Earl," she said, "I've been thinking, What if we turned West Mesa into a recovery ranch for abandoned horses? Earl didn't answer right away. He looked out toward Starling, thoughtful. You think people will bring their horses all the way out here? Not people, Lana smiled. But the horses. They'll come, because they need someone like you. And a place like this. Earl nodded slowly and smiled. A week later, a new wooden sign was nailed to the old ranch gate. Starling's Rest, Mustang Rescue and Recovery. The news spread quickly. A truck arrived from Kansas with 2 wild horses found abandoned on the roadside. A woman from Arizona brought an aging, half-blind mare that had been abused by its former owner. Each horse came with a story, and at Starling's Rest they were heard, not in words, but through soft hands, kind eyes, and the comfort of sunlit grass. Noah, the young man who once left Starling behind, was now the head stable caretaker. He didn't talk much, but he was always the first to arrive each morning and the last to leave each night. Every time a new horse arrived, Noah would sit beside them, give them a name, and tell them about Starling, as if passing on a belief. One day, he brought Earl a small colt, only a few months old, with dappled gray fur and a slight limp in its hind leg. I call him Piper, Noah said. He was found after a barn fire near Durango. They say his leg can't be fixed. Earl sat beside the colt, running a calloused hand down its spine. They said the same about Starling once. Starling was no longer a racer, but a guide. Every morning, he would walk the fence line with Earl, then circle back to the main barn, where the younger horses watched him with awe. Gradually, even the most withdrawn horses began to walk. Then trot, then neigh. Starling didn't need to do anything grand. His presence alone was enough to awaken life. One afternoon, as Lana was preparing a grant proposal for national recognition of Starling's Rest, the phone rang. On the other end was an elderly woman from Montana. I heard about Mr. Earl Whitaker, she said. I have an old Mustang named Maggie. No one cares about her anymore. But I heard that in your place, even the forgotten ones get called by name. Lana's voice caught in her throat. Then she replied gently, Bring Maggie. No living thing is forgotten here. Earl kept writing in his notebook each evening, not to track chores, but to record stories. Stories about Starling, about the first day he was rescued, about the day he taught an entire stadium what unconditional love looked like. One entry read, Some things can't be bought or measured, like the way a horse looks at you when it's chosen to trust you. Starling isn't just a horse. He's the first wind of spring, blowing through places we thought had turned to stone. That May, at the annual Mustang Festival, Starling didn't compete, but he was invited as a guest of honor. When Earl led him into the main arena, the crowd rose to their feet. There were no cheers, just a silence so deep you could hear the flags rustle in the wind. Earl gave a quiet nod. I'm no hero, he said softly. I was just lucky enough to be chosen by a creature who saw something in me. He rested a hand on Starling's neck. Since that day, I've never felt alone again. When they returned to West Mesa, the sky was lit with sunset fire. Birds flew overhead, casting long shadows across the cottonwood trees lining the creek. Starling stood at the top of a hill. Wind tangled through his mane. Then he ran, full speed down the slope, as if carrying every ounce of youth, every unspoken belief, straight into the light of day's end. Earl whispered behind him, hand pressed to his heart. Run, kid. You're the wind, and the wind can never be caged. Morning rain came to West Mesa, a rare spring gift in the land of red soil. Droplets clung to the old wooden fence, catching the pale sunlight that peeked through silver clouds. In the large barn, Starling stood still, gazing outward, ears twitching, eyes gleaming with something strange and bright. Earl entered, carrying a bundle of dry hay, but before he could set it down, Starling turned and pressed his head into Earl's chest. Earl paused, then smiled, running a hand gently along the horse's spine. It's been a while since you looked at me like that. What is it, boy? Just then, Lana came hurrying up from the driveway, waving a thick envelope, sealed and stamped with official emblems. Uncle Earl, a letter from the Mustang Federation. He opened it slowly. Beneath the stiff-typed lines was something he never expected. Starling had been nominated as a national symbol of Mustang recovery, the first Mustang ever chosen. More than that, the organization was inviting Starling to appear in the upcoming National Mustang Parade in Denver as the representative for all horses once abandoned and now reborn. Earl said nothing at first. A wave of emotion swelled inside him, part pride, part fear. "You don't have to say yes," Lana said gently. "They'll understand." But Earl shook his head and turned to Starling. "No. This time, he gets to choose. If he wants to go, I'll go with him." Denver in April was colder than West Mesa. Tall buildings pierced the sky, and Earl felt like a wrinkle on the map. But Starling walked beside him, calm, poised, like he belonged in both places. The parade took place on the city's main boulevard. Thousands of people, reporters and cameras lined the streets. Starling, fitted with a handmade saddle crafted by inmates from a prison rehabilitation program, led the procession, head high, mane flowing in the wind. The crowd chanted his name. But Starling didn't flinch. He kept glancing sideways, checking for Earl, as if to say, "We're still together." After the event, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a dark suit approached. He extended a hand. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm the state governor. My wife's followed your story since the beginning." Earl simply nodded, shaking his hand. "We're proposing a new bill, the Starling Act, to increase funding for wild horse rescues across the Southwest, and we'd like you to speak before the state legislature." Earl blinked. He had never imagined that, at his age, he'd be asked to do something like this. "I don't speak in public." "You don't need to say much," the governor smiled. "Just speak the life you've lived." 2 weeks later, at the New Mexico State Capitol, Earl Whitaker stood behind the podium. No papers, no prepared speech, just him and the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm no politician. I'm just an old man who lives with a horse. And that horse, he taught me that sometimes all a living thing needs is not to be left behind." He paused, glancing at Starling standing quietly just below the stage. "That horse was once considered useless, like a lot of us, but if a creature like him can rediscover his worth, then so can we." The room was silent. Then applause erupted, first in the back rows, then throughout the chamber. The Starling Act passed a week later. On the first summer morning in June, Lana held a small ceremony for the new barn at Starling's Rest. The rescue now housed over 20 horses, each one scarred, each one healing. Earl planted a large oak tree in the middle of the pasture. On its bark he carved, "This is where the wind runs free." Noah had begun drafting plans for a children's program, teaching kids how to understand and care for wild horses. He called it Little Winds, named after what Starling used to be before he could run. One day, Earl received a letter from Austin, from a 12-year-old boy named Timmy. "I was left at a bus station. My mom never came back. But when I read about Starling, I felt like I was him. Now I live in a foster home. And one day, when I'm free, I want to come meet you and Starling." Earl wiped his eyes, then picked up a pen and wrote back, "Starling is waiting for you, and so am I." That evening, the breeze was light. Earl sat on the porch steps, eyes closed. Starling walked over, resting his head on Earl's shoulder. No words, no grand gestures, just a quiet presence, a peace Earl once believed belonged only to fading dreams. He whispered, "We made it home, didn't we, boy?" Starling didn't reply, but in that tender touch, the whole universe seemed to nod. If you believe that every creature, no matter how small, deserves a second chance at love, leave a 1 in the comments below. If you've ever witnessed a story of healing like Starling's, type 0, so we know you're with us. Don't forget to subscribe to True Animal Stories. There are still so many powerful journeys between people and animals waiting to be discovered.